They say some names are best left unspoken. In the Appalachian highlands, there are hollows where no map dares stretch, where mist clings low to the earth, and the trees twist like blackened fingers around secrets that never see daylight. And in those woods, one name lingers like a curse: the Fletchers, a family spoken of only in whispers, a clan whose story was buried in silence, because to speak it aloud was to invite the darkness they carried. The Fletcher Line began like any other, hard-working farmers who scraped their living from stubborn soil, men and women who knelt in church pews, their voices low, their clothes simple. But isolation is a cruel architect. A family tucked too deep into the hills begins to fold inward, marrying among their own, binding blood to blood, until the tree of kinship twists into something unnatural. So it was with the Fletchers. At first, no one noticed a cousin marrying. A cousin was not unheard of in remote places where neighbors were few, and travel was dangerous. But generation upon generation of turning inward made the Fletcher bloodline more fragile, their children pale, sickly, their minds shadowed. Still, the clan grew. Their log cabins multiplied in the hollow, their presence thickened, and the town below learned to keep its distance. For to interfere with the Fletchers was to court disaster. Inside their cabins, candlelight burned low. The air was thick with the smell of boiled roots, salted hides, and the damp rot of timber never properly dried. Children huddled by the hearth, their eyes too large for their faces, their skin stretched tight as paper. They whispered only when necessary. Laughter had been starved out of the Fletcher home. Every room was heavy with silence, the kind that grows when fear is the only language a family knows. The patriarch ruled with an iron gripped in skeletal hands, but eyes like coal that glowed in the dimness. His word was not to be questioned. A look from him could silence a room. It was he who decided who would marry whom, which daughter would be given to which brother, which child would be raised, and which would be allowed to wither. He carried the authority of both father and executioner. The family obeyed not out of love, but because obedience was survival. And then came the winters. In Appalachia, winters were crueler than most. The mountains swallowed the sun early, nights stretched long, and snow buried the valleys. Families prayed their harvests would last. Most of them leaned on neighbors when supplies grew thin, trading what little they had, sharing to survive. But the Fletchers never asked. They closed their doors, their cabins locked from the inside, their windows boarded, and when the snow melted in spring, they emerged leaner, but alive. Too alive. That was when the rumors began. Hunters returning from the high trails spoke of strange finds in the snow bones, stripped clean, cracked open as though for marrow. Travelers passing near the Fletcher Hollow sometimes vanished without a trace. Search parties returned empty-handed, their faces pale, their voices low. Some said the woods themselves swallowed men whole. Others whispered of the Fletchers, always the Fletchers. In town, whispers grew sharper. Women in church pressed their children close when a Fletcher appeared at the back pew. Men crossed the street rather than share a path. No one could prove anything, yet fear spread faster than fire. It was said the Fletchers had endured winters, not through God's grace, but by feeding on what no man should consume. They became something less than human, something more like beasts cloaked in human form. Inside their cabins, the truth rotted. The hunger was constant, stretching beyond the body and into the soul. The children grew up learning not just how to trap or snare, but how to butcher in silence. They were told that hunger was the devil testing them, but that family came before all else. And so, in the Fletcher Hollow, boundaries blurred. The bloodline thickened into a knot, and the line between kinship and survival disappeared entirely. The woods grew watchful. Farmers claimed to see pale figures moving between the trees at dusk, silent and swift. Travelers told of eyes watching from the tree line, unblinking, the way a predator marks its prey. No one ever dared enter the hollow. It was not merely a place. It was a wound in the mountain itself, festering, hidden, waiting, and still, the Fletchers endured. Through the decades, the stories hardened into legend. Families told their children never to wander near the smoke that rose from beyond the ridge. Do not follow it. Do not speak the name. Do not look into the woods if you hear footsteps behind you, for if you turned, you might see them watching. The Fletchers were not just a family anymore. They were a warning. They were hunger given flesh, secrecy given voice, the curse of blood, turned inward. And those who lived in the valleys below knew the truth in their bones. One day, the hollow would not be enough to contain them. That is where the story begins, not with proof, not with confrontation, but with silence. A silence so heavy it pressed on the chest of every man, woman, and child who lived within sight of the Fletcher Hills. A silence that told them the truth long before any words were spoken. Something lived up there that should never have been allowed to survive, and soon, that silence would break. The silence did not last forever. It never does. It began with a single disappearance, small, almost forgettable. A trapper from the valley, who had taken his dogs up into the mountains before the first frost. When he did not return, the town whispered but did not search. Men, like him, often vanished in the highlands. Snow, wolves, exhaustion. Appalachia has many ways of burying its dead. But weeks later, when the dogs returned, they staggered down the road gaunt, ribs showing through their matted fur, their eyes wild. Around their necks still clung the torn leather straps of broken leads, and tied to one of those straps, hanging, limp and stained, was a strip of cloth, not from the trapper's coat, but from a child's dress. The valley stirred. Old whispers rose again. Still, no one climbed the ridge. The Fletcher Hollow was a place where men entered but did not return. Fear had become stronger than curiosity, stronger than justice. But fear is not universal. A handful of hunters, braver or more foolish than most, decided to venture close. They did not cross the border of the hollow not yet, but they pressed, near enough to smell the smoke of damp fires. In the snow, they found bones, not deer bones, not bear, but smaller, more delicate. And in the marrow of those bones, someone had split them wide. The hunters fled. They told no one at first, for to accuse was to risk retribution. But in time the stories leaked, carried in hushed tones around tavern tables and over church pews. Some scoffed, calling it frontier gossip. Others nodded grimly. For in the Fletcher Hollow, the truth was always worse than the telling. Inside the cabins, the hunger deepened. Each generation carried it, not as a burden, but as a way of life. Sons were given to their sisters, daughters to their uncles, until faces began to warp. Jaws too sharp, eyes set too deep, limbs that grew crooked. The children were born weaker each time, and yet more desperate. The family's bloodline was not a tree, but a circle tightening on itself, strangling what little light remained. And when food thinned, as it always did, the patriarchs taught the younger ones what must be done. They whispered by candlelight, as the pot boiled low, as the shadows lengthened against the cabin walls. Survival, they said, was not sin if it kept the bloodline alive. Survival justified all things. And so the hollow became a place where even death had no dignity, where flesh was consumed not by earth or flame, but by the mouths of kin. The valley people noticed more. Travelers who passed too near the ridge came back, speaking of shapes moving at night, figures that were not wolves, not men, but something between. Farmers found their traps emptied, the steel springs smeared with blood, but no animal caught. Once, a wagon carrying supplies broke an axle on the road near the hollow. When a rescue party arrived days later, they found the horses gone, the driver's seat empty, the wagon stripped bare. Only the wheel tracks remained, veering toward the trees, as if something had dragged it into the forest. The sheriff of the valley town swore he would confront them. For years, he had heard the tales, dismissed them as superstition. But when his own brother failed to return from a hunting trip near the Fletcher Hollow, something in him hardened. He rode up the mountain with 2 deputies, carrying rifles and lanterns. The townsfolk gathered at the edge of the ridge to watch their lights fade into the trees. They waited. 1 night, 2, 3. On the 4th day, the horses returned, riderless, reins frayed and stained. The saddles were gone. The sheriff and his deputies were never seen again. From that day, no lawman set foot on the ridge again. The hollow was given over to the Fletchers entirely, abandoned to its curse. Generations passed. The family grew stranger, more insular, their cabins multiplying like rot across the hillside. No one could count how many there were now. Children were born in silence, raised in shadows, taught to speak only when spoken to. Some said the Fletchers had forgotten the sound of laughter entirely, and yet they endured. Through famine, through winter storms, through wars that shook the valleys. Below, the Fletcher Hollow remained. They survived where others perished, and that survival came at a cost too terrible to name. The valley townsfolk told stories to their children. Stories meant not to entertain, but to warn. Do not wander past the ridge. Do not answer voices in the trees. If you smell smoke where no cabin should be, turn back. If you hear footsteps behind you, do not look. And above all else, never speak the name Fletcher aloud in the dark, because the hollow was not empty. The hollow was watching, and one day it would not be enough to stay hidden. One day, hunger would drive them out. Hunger is patient, but hunger is relentless. For decades, the Fletcher Hollow had managed to devour itself in silence, feeding on its own, turning inward, sustaining the bloodline with what little flesh it could claim. But blood runs thin, and bodies do not last forever. When the earth grows barren, when the snares are empty, when the river offers only stones and bones, the hunger begins to whisper louder than any command. It began with fire, one winter, so bitter. The trees split open in the cold. Smoke rose from the hollow, not as thin threads, but as black columns. The flames devoured one of the cabins, and with it, a family within. The embers were not buried, not extinguished. They were consumed. Charred fragment taken into the mouths of kin who could no longer distinguish between survival and desecration. And in the silence after the fire, the hollow seemed changed, no longer hidden, no longer contained. The first victim came soon after. A peddler from the valley, known for hauling bolts of cloth and ribbons up into the hills, vanished on the road. His cart was found overturned, his horse gnawed to the bone, the fabric shredded into strips that hung like banners from the trees. The sheriff's fate still lingered in memory, so no rescue was mounted. The valley turned its head, but they whispered, "The Fletchers are moving." Soon it was not just travelers. A young girl fetching water from a stream never returned. Her bucket was found half buried in the mud, its handle bent as though by hands that did not know their own strength. A farmer's hogs were taken in the night, their squeals echoing down the ridge, until silence fell like a curtain. The people of the valley tried to fight the dread with prayer. They gathered in the church, their voices rising in hymns, meant to banish darkness. But even in that sanctuary, some swore they heard movement outside the window, shapes darting between the gravestones, crouching low against the walls. When lanterns were raised, there was nothing. Nothing but the sound of twigs breaking under unseen feet. And then came the night of screams. It began with the Miller homestead, perched on the far edge of the valley, closest to the ridge. Lanterns were seen flaring, shadows thrashing against the windows. The neighbors heard cries so piercing they carried across the fields. By the time anyone dared to approach, the house was silent. Inside, the hearth still glowed, but the men were gone, every one of them. No blood, no bodies, only the sound of wind through the broken door. The valley erupted in terror. For the first time, the people spoke openly of the Fletcher Hollow, of the curse that had grown too strong to be contained. Men loaded rifles. Women gathered their children close. A group of 20 set out, torches in hand, to march up the ridge and end it once and for all. They never returned. Days later, their torches were found extinguished, stuck upright in the soil, like grave markers along the path. The valley was collapsing. Families fled in wagons, leaving behind homes and fields. Those who stayed locked their doors at sundown, keeping their children silent. The woods, once a source of life, became a wall of eyes staring back. The hollow had become a mouth, opening wider, hungrier, reaching outward. But hunger cannot last forever. It burns too hot, consumes too much. As suddenly as the attacks began, they ceased. The smoke from the hollow dwindled. The shapes in the trees vanished. Some said the Fletchers had finally devoured one another, that the curse had eaten its own heart. Others believed they had only gone deeper into caves, into tunnels, into places where no sunlight would ever reach. Years passed. The valley slowly rebuilt, though the scars never healed. The Miller farm remained abandoned, its windows black, its roof sagging like a corpse. Children were warned not to go near. Travelers were still told to avoid the ridge. But no one climbed it, no one looked. And so the hollow became legend. But legends do not die. They wait, in the rustling of leaves at midnight, in the creak of floorboards when no one moves, in the taste of iron that sometimes lingers on the wind. The Fletcher hollow breathes still. Generations later, hikers and wanderers would claim to hear laughter, deep in the woods, high-pitched, broken, too close to human and too far from it. Others swore they found strange footprints in the mud, not wolf, not man, but something twisted between. The Fletchers had become more than a family. They had become a presence. A warning carved into the very bones of Appalachia, and perhaps the most terrifying truth is not that they vanished, but that they endured, that somewhere, deep in the mountains, their hollow still waits, that even now, the hunger whispers, that even now, the fire has not gone out. Asterisk, the Fletchers may have been swallowed by their hollow, but their shadow still lingers. Perhaps it waits in the caves, perhaps it breathes through the trees. Perhaps it has only changed its face. If this story unsettled you, know this: there are others, buried just as deep, waiting to be unearthed. Join us as we descend further into America's forgotten past. Subscribe, share, and keep walking with us into the dark. For the silence of these mountains is never truly empty.